Well, good morning, everybody, and a warm welcome to today's webinar entitled Research Skills, the Challenges in Delivering the Knowledge and Skills Required for Excellent Researchers. Over the course of the next 35 to 45 minutes or so, we'll be listening to a discussion exploring some of the key developments in the needs of and challenges facing postgraduate researchers from Professor Fiona Denney and Professor Douglas Halliday. We'll also explore how our updated suite of training programs, Research Skills Toolkit, can help your institution best support supervisors negotiating these developments. This will be followed by a brief Q&A. Next slide. You'll hear from 4 people today. Firstly, from Epigeum, you'll hear from myself, Matthew. I'm a marketing executive at Epigeum. Secondly, Victoria Stoner, our Senior Academic Partnerships Manager. Victoria will share an overview of the updated Research Skills Toolkit with you. Most importantly, you'll hear from our guest presenters. We're lucky to have 2 key figures in postgraduate research with us today, both of whom are lead advisors for Research Skills Toolkit, Fiona Denney and Douglas Halliday. Fiona Denney is Professor in Business Education at Brunel Business School and is a former member of the UK Council for Graduate Education's Executive Committee. Douglas Halliday is Director of the Multidisciplinary Centre for Doctoral Training in Energy, Durham University, and the Chair of the UK Council for Graduate Education's Executive Committee. Moving on to what we'll be covering today in a little more detail. First of all, we'll hear from Fiona Denney, who will be discussing the challenges institutions face in supporting researcher development throughout COVID, with a specific focus on social science researchers and how research skills training can help them face these challenges. Next, Douglas will take us through the wider research context today, research cultures, the pressures of responding to COVID, and the place for research training in this environment. Victoria will then share some of the features and benefits of the Research Skills Toolkit and how it will address the challenges we've explored today. We will then wrap up by answering any questions you may have. Speaking of questions, everybody on the call today is currently muted to help avoid any audio issues. However, please do get involved and ask any questions. You should all be able to see a control panel for the GoToWebinar software we're using today. The panel is normally at the top or on the right-hand side of your screen and can be expanded or hidden by clicking on a white arrow on an orange background. Within the control panel, you should see a questions drop-down where you'll be able to type in your question. So with no further ado, I'll pass you on to Fiona Denney for her discussion on research skills.
Thanks very much, Matthew. So as Matthew said, I've been asked to talk about the challenges in delivering the knowledge and skills required for excellent postgraduate researchers. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about some of the challenges faced by universities during COVID over the past year. And then I'm going to go on to more common challenges that social science researchers face especially. And then I'm going to talk about some of the essential skills that researchers need and the use and the benefits of the Research Skills Toolkit. Next slide, please. So, I mean, COVID's been challenging for all of us in a variety of different ways. And when I was thinking about this, I was thinking about it in terms of some fairly discrete elements around postgraduate researchers. So when we talk about postgraduate researchers, we talk about postgraduate taught students who are doing a master's dissertation. And we also talk about postgraduate research students or doctoral students who are doing a doctorate. And they will have a mix of remote supervision and usually in-person supervision, but also delivery of core and talk components of programs, which are obviously more common at master's level than they are at doctoral level. But even if you're doing a professional doctorate, there will be some element of taught components. So there's obviously been this challenge that COVID's posed to us all, which has meant that the core taught components of programs have had to be delivered remotely and online. And then also supervision has been taking place remotely as well. So we've been trying to battle with things like different time zones, Wi-Fi connections, often digital poverty, and other problems. For example, COVID itself has produced a number of issues amongst students that I've been working with. It's certainly taken its toll on both physical and mental health, and also much wider than that. So I've had students overseas in countries where the infrastructure is not as good as it is in the UK, and where there have been additional problems caused by things like flooding, electrical outages, all kinds of things like that. So the key focus really for all of us, as it always is, and that hasn't changed in itself, is around supporting students effectively to ensure timely completion and to reduce non-submission. But that's really probably been the most significant challenge over the past year. Next slide, please. So I think where we are now is an evolving picture. So we went through an immediate pivot to online for everything, and I think most colleagues on this call will be aware of that. But essentially what we were doing was we were replicating a lot of in-person teaching via a digital medium. We weren't actually really redesigning our courses and programs for the online space in a really effective way. I think that's shifting, and I think there's now an increasing focus on more effective use of blended materials, which is obviously where Epigeum and the Research Skills Toolkit really comes in and can really come into its own. In terms of online supervision, we've seen this picture where we've had to identify appropriate platforms, times, connections, and where we've had to try and pick up on cues for other problems that our students might be facing. And that is particularly difficult because in an in-person, person-to-person setting, you can really feel other people's emotions and pick up on what's going on. But it is much harder to do that in an online space. And so I've had to, for example, consciously give a time in supervisions with students where I've said to them, is there anything else that I need to be aware of? What other problems are you facing? And that's opened up a lot of conversations that perhaps might otherwise not have happened, and I might not have been aware of a lot of problems that they were facing. I have to say that in my context, in business studies, it's not unusual for business studies students to be remotely supervised for master's students in particular, master's dissertations in particular. Often at the end of the taught part of the programme, students will go to the area that they're from, their home area, and we will do a lot of supervision remotely anyway. So to some extent we are used to that, but I think we've had to work a lot harder around ensuring that our students have had the right information at the right time, and we've continued to face the challenges of digital poverty and physical and mental health, and that's something that will continue for a long time yet. I think we're still right at the very beginning stages of seeing the impact, particularly on mental health, that COVID and the lockdowns have had. Next slide, please. In general, there are a set of challenges that social science researchers face that can delay timely submission. They often don't know where to start with their research. It's a very different place from doing laboratory-based sciences. They either find that there's too much literature or not enough, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And they often underestimate the importance of a methodological perspective as a starting point. So I'm going to talk a little bit in the next couple of minutes just about some of these things. Next slide, please. Social science students often start with a very general idea of what they want to research rather than a specific research question or problem. And we often spend a considerable amount of time right at the very beginning of research projects, where we try to get the students to be able to refine the scope of the project down to something that's both practicable and original, and that's pretty difficult in meeting both of those objectives relatively in a relatively timely manner. So lots and lots of discussion at the beginning stages that perhaps doesn't happen quite so much in the science areas, where perhaps the project is more clearly defined before the student actually comes on board. Social science students often need to spend a lot of time reading around the subject area in order to identify the research gap, and they often underestimate the amount of time that it can take to do this, and the amount of time that needs to be dedicated to reading. Next slide, please. As a result, that can lead them to a situation where they're encountering literally thousands of journal articles related to the broad topic areas of interest. And it's crucial that our students develop effective literature searching approaches. And obviously, we're very lucky in that often the subject-specific librarians are skilled in helping our students to do that, but it's often something that they feel completely at sea about in the beginning stages. Sometimes we find the opposite, that students claim that there's literally no literature in their field, which is often a misunderstanding of the fact that the literature review needs to start broad and then focus down. And they don't really understand what it's for and how to approach it overall. Next slide, please. We also find that sometimes our students underestimate the importance of having a methodological perspective as a starting point. So I talk a lot to my students about the fact that it's really important to understand your own philosophical perspective on the world before conducting research, so that you know where you're coming at the research from. And this is something that's really important in the social sciences. Part of the issue is that we use confusing terms that are not often used in daily language, such as phenomenology and positivism. And students get really confused about what those terms mean in terms of their own specific research project and their own perspective. So we really welcome any resources that can help with actually giving our students an opportunity to be able to revise those terms on a regular basis and to be able to spend some time thinking about the philosophical perspective that they're coming at. It's really important that students understand that these are guiding points to help to steer the research design. And we spend a lot of time trying to ensure that our students have clarity at the beginning so that they're not so confused later on in the research when they need to be focusing on other things. Next slide, please. Overall, essential skills in the social sciences really focus our students on the ability to be able to conceive their research project as a fixed term project with a deadline and deliverables. And that's not always been part of the language of social sciences research over the past few decades, but it is becoming to be much more of a focus for both students and for staff as well. We need to really hold on to this notion that we are giving our students an apprenticeship in social science research. They don't know what they don't know, and it is all a learning experience for them. As such, there's a really crucial role of the supervisor in this. We need to be acting as a guide and an advisor throughout the project, but not taking away the ownership of the project from the student themselves. But that's quite a lot for the student to be developing in terms of skills throughout the whole project. So there's a wide variety of both interpersonal skills and research specific skills that are going on here. Next slide, please. Overall, I think there are huge benefits in courses like the Research Skills Toolkit from Epigeum. I think in particular, we are very much in need of resources in a good online format that can help with the onboarding of our research students and the initiation into the world of research skills that is, for most of them, something that they've not encountered before, and certainly not in the way in which they need to do it for masters and for doctoral level. We're very much in need of something that provides introductions to a lot of key terminology and concepts that sometimes supervisors may forget to mention, and gives the students a resource that they can check back in with on a regular occasion when they need to be able to access the information in a timely and immediate fashion. Essentially, this is a way into the bigger picture of the field that they're going to be working in. And it will hopefully help them to feel as though they've not been dropped in at the deep end, but gives them a more gradual and reassuring resource for the research that they're going to be doing in the future. So that's my section, and I'm now going to hand over to Douglas Halliday from Durham University. Douglas.
Well, thank you very much, Fiona, and thank you, Matthew, for that introduction and overview from your perspective. My academic discipline is physics, so I'm going to be talking a little bit from my own perspective as a scientist involved in the physical sciences and engineering disciplines. And really, I want to touch on a number of key issues, the challenges faced by researchers, thinking about the core research project and how the online tool that we're thinking about today can support that. I want to think about support for the candidate as a whole, as an individual, because I think that's a key element of one of the things we have learned very much during the pandemic. I also want to think a little bit about the wider research context and the challenges of research that some of researchers in my disciplinary areas might face. And then finally, I'd like to say just a few words about research culture and the wider research environment and how the Research Skills Toolkit can help connect with that. So moving on to the next slide, please. So I think many of colleagues on the call today will recognise the challenges faced by researchers, and I'm focusing very much on those undertaking research degrees or higher degrees by research at master's level and doctoral level. There is an expectation that they have to design an original research project. They have to learn a broad range of new skills in order to successfully complete that project. They have to develop both a breadth of knowledge and a depth of knowledge in a specific field or specialization. Fiona was talking about the literature review. That's one way in which the research project is very much set in context. But in addition to that, they have to then develop their own insights, their own understandings, and connect through the literature review and through their own sites into a wider, increasingly extensive and more complex research environment today. We talk about developing a scholarly approach, but what does that mean? That means things like analytical skills, academic rigor, this idea of questioning things, this idea of interrogating findings, the ideas of informed inquiry. So all the sort of dimensions and elements of scholarship that established academics would bring to bear on a particular problem, often without actually necessarily recognize them in such a way. It's part of our practice, it's part of who we are. There's an expectation that candidates have to work independently. And in the last year and a half, there have been a whole range of pressures about the way that candidates need to respond to the restrictions imposed by the COVID-19 pandemic. Reduction in time, limited access to research facilities, no travel, no networking, none of the stimulating environment and interaction that really fires up researchers and gets them motivated, or the interactions that can keep them going through some of the challenges and demands that will always come in the middle of a research degree. So for me, part of the response to the pandemic is, as supporters of research candidates, we need to think about more efficient and more timely development of researchers from the outset. It's no longer a case of just putting them into the research group and letting them see what's going on and pick things up. I think there needs to be a more of an edge and more of a focus to, what Fiona called onboarding. And, the Research Skills Toolkit has a really important role to play in that. Next slide, please. So colleagues in the UK will recognise this document. Colleagues from outside the UK, this is our framework for higher education qualifications, which is owned and maintained on behalf of the HE sector by the Quality Assurance Agency. And this would be, well, what you can see here effectively is the qualification descriptor for doctoral degrees. So you can see here, the complexity of the process that we expect our candidates to undertake: creation and interpretation of new knowledge, original research, advanced scholarship, systematic acquisition and understanding of substantial body of knowledge, and a general ability to conceptualize, design, and implement a project, detailed understanding of techniques, that's focusing very much on the evidence that the candidates might present through their research project, through their theses, through an oral examination or viva, if that is part of the assessment. But more broadly, in the longer term, I think we're also thinking about the skills that these candidates have, make informed judgments on complex issues in specialist fields. Well, if ever we've had a global example of people that we've needed to do that, I think the pandemic has, illustrated that very clearly. Complex judgments need to be held in tension, considering a whole range of factors. That requires a lot of insights, a lot of analytical skills. Continue to undertake pure and/or applied research and development at an advanced level, contributing substantially to the development of new techniques, ideas, or approaches. So that opens up an understanding of how candidates might develop in the future following on from their qualifications. So of course, all of this is about building skills, building confidence, and building identity of a researcher during the research project. Research degrees are ostensibly awarded recognizing that you gain research expertise by doing research yourself. It's an individual process, and that's one of the challenges that we face. Researchers are a very heterogeneous community. Each research project is individual and unique to that candidate. And that raises the question about how much structure is required for each candidate. What's the level of support? So again, something like the Research Skills Toolkit that has a lot of flexibility and pathways through it can offer, in many ways, a sort of bespoke experience for individual candidates. And for me, I think that's really important part of training and support, through that complex individual path. Next slide, please. So for me, looking after the whole candidate and the whole individual, I think I always recognized that as an experienced researcher of 30 years. But, the pandemic has really brought that into focus. A doctorate or a master's is an incredibly intensive and invested process. Candidates are giving up a huge amount, particularly international candidates, in my experience, giving up a huge amount to come and learn and benefit and capitalize on the opportunities that higher education institutions offer to them. So we need to provide a broad range of support, and supervisors are not experts in everything, but our role is to guide and help a candidate navigate a path through the research project. But I think increasingly we need to be able to provide support for candidates as well across a whole dimension. And well-being is a really important dimension of that. So as it says there, institutions need a flexible and robust structured support, which enables all candidates to achieve their individual outcomes. And that requires support both from a supervisory team, both from a wider research group, both from the academic school or department, maybe from a graduate school or a doctoral college, and through interactions that candidates might have with other researchers or other research groups at conferences and online and so on. And all of that interaction and activity can help, I believe, to instill a sense of purpose, a sense of direction, and a sense of achievement that can really help with the well-being issue. I think all of us that work in this area now recognize that well-being of researchers is an incredibly important issue. We've seen an expansion in the literature and research on this. The UK Council for Graduate Education recently, earlier this year, ran an international conference on mental health and well-being. So these are really important, and that is not separate from the experience of the candidates. So I think offering a really positive experience through a whole range of opportunities to engage goes some way, I think, towards providing that positive research culture, that positive experience, and that sense of purpose that candidates can imagine or envisage an individual route to success for themselves, notwithstanding, challenges that they might face in a research project, particularly at the early stages. Next slide, please. So the wider research context is increasingly evolving. you know, there is a lot of regulation, there's a lot of external requirements. Research funders have a whole range of issues that, you know, research candidates, doctoral candidates, master's candidates have to be familiar with. And, you know, UKIRI, for those outside the UK, is the UK Research and Innovation. It's a recently formed organisation that brings together all the 7 UK research councils plus Innovate UK into a single umbrella organisation. And, you know, they have an increasing amount of regulations, as it says there, the regulatory environment. So issues such as data access and storage policies for publicly funded research. Data and metadata needs to be published and freely available within 12 months of obtaining the data. They have to provide secure storage for 10 years. You know, and there's a lot of emphasis on openness, on transparency, on accessibility. And, you know, that's something that candidates need to be aware of from the outset when you're designing your experiment. You know, no longer can you have a spreadsheet with a whole load of cryptic columns and some numbers in it, and that's it. You know, the data cannot be made accessible unless it is brought to life through, you know, correct curation, through metadata, through all sorts of organization and structure. And, you know, those are valuable skills that researchers can learn and can think about, and will set them in good stead, you know, for whatever they move on to in the future. Responsible innovation. So this is another area where research councils in the UK, you know, have been really emphasizing the importance of that. So that's thinking about how, you know, scientific, well, all research really offers opportunities for innovation that are both adding value to society, but are done in a way that are socially desirable and are responsible and have a sort of the context of the wider public interest in mind. You know, so there are lots of research projects where applications could go off in any number of different directions. Technology, for example, can be a tremendous tool for wider public benefit. But, you know, there are some complex questions that one needs to be aware of about, you know, what technology may and may not be used for. And, you know, the same issues apply across all disciplines in the social sciences, you know, in the humanities, where people are maybe thinking about ethics, thinking about, you know, sort of religious frameworks, thinking about structure of societies. These are complex questions that, you know, researchers need to be aware of in terms of building in a sort of recognition and appreciation that there is a responsibility. You know, someone who has the power to generate new knowledge has to be aware of the requirement for wider public benefit. This is a key role of being an ethical researcher today. That's really important. So, you know, again, these are all dimensions of research that people need to think about. So we can move on to the next slide, please. So, you know, Fiona talked about sort of methodological challenges in the social sciences, and, you know, that's absolutely right. But, you know, sciences, physical sciences, engineering, you know, STEM subjects, they have their own sort of research challenges. You know, there is a growing complexity to research projects in the STEM area nowadays. You know, research can range from a small group to an international collaboration. You know, that requires research candidates to understand a whole breadth of different areas and different topics. You know, candidates need a good grounding in methodologies and in the principles of research. They need to understand, you know, they have a research question they want to be able to answer. They have a sort of, you know, an understanding of, you know, how scientists do research, the methodological sort of framework. But actually, you know, they need to be informed by some of the principles I've already talked about. They need to understand that, you know, research method is not an end in itself, but is a tool to help them undertake a structured, designed program to answer their research question. You know, so methodologies can flex and evolve and change and be flexible. You know, there are different approaches. So the research methods in practice in the STEM, arts and humanities and social science courses that are part of this will give candidates a real good grounding in the different research methods, the different approaches. And it helps candidates to explore approaches from different backgrounds. I've worked in a doctoral training centre or doctoral programme that's based around energy, and it is purposely multidisciplinary. So we will bring together candidates from different disciplines to talk about energy from their own perspective. Because one of the challenges that we face in energy is the idea that energy is a technology that serves to to serve society and provide energy. So there is a sort of an interface between society, between individuals, both at the individual level, but also at larger level, at the city level, at the country level, that connects with and interfaces with technology. So the energy challenge and the sort of climate emergency, climate crisis cannot be solved by scientists and engineers alone. It requires insight from geographers, from anthropologists, from sociologists who understand society from particular perspectives. So that all connects. Now, that approach is maybe not for everybody, but I think it's helpful to open a window for candidates so that they can ask the question, does this perspective offer any insights into my research that might lead me in new directions or might offer new opportunities? So at the end of the day, the methodological challenge, as I call it here, is about building a foundation that enables more effective and efficient engagement with the research project, from the outset. And that sort of connects in a way really with, what I was saying earlier about the sort of challenges posed by COVID and the need to get candidates up to speed or onboarded more quickly. So next slide, please. So this is the sort of final slide for me, and this is just some reflections and thoughts about, the wider research culture and wider research environment. Here in the UK, and I'm sure in many other sort of research intensive areas, people are thinking about the wider environment and the role that that plays for researchers. Research is a global activity. You connect with individuals through their areas of expertise, and that is not constrained by geography, by geopolitical boundaries, and so on. So we want to enable our candidates to think about how we can offer them, what I've called a healthy and vibrant culture, an environment to support the candidate, an environment that stimulates them, an environment where they have access to resources. Could be the supervisory team, could be Research Skills Toolkit, could be, the institution library, it could be, any number of different things, but they all sort of fit together in a sort of interconnected way as a sort of backdrop against which researchers can connect with at different times, depending on different needs. And, training plays such an important role to offer that supportive and enabling culture, in how research is conducted. So I think for me, the Research Skills Toolkit has a legitimate role to play, really, in being one pillar of that support that can be offered through, the wider research culture that we are seeking to develop and promote at all our institutions. And, I think it provides reference points, benchmarks, and, I think it offers opportunities really to support candidates in ways that enable them to sort of meet the expectations that are placed on them by the supervisory team, by the regulations of the institution, by their sponsors and funders, and, by other stakeholders who have an interest in the research project. So I think being able to do that successfully, I think, is a key way to ensuring that all our candidates achieve a timely and successful outcome at the end of their research degree. So thank you very much. I'm going to hand back to my colleagues at Epigeum now.
Well, thank you very much to Fiona and Douglas for sharing their fascinating insights and expertise on this subject. It's an area that's clearly of increasing importance to higher education institutions and postgraduate researchers. Now, I'd like to pass you on to Victoria Stoner for a look at the Research Skills Toolkit. a suite of blended learning resources, including interactive online multimedia and materials and workshop session plans for postgraduate researchers.
Thank you, Matthew, and thank you, Douglas and Fiona. The Research Skills Toolkit is a suite of flexible, streamlined, and comprehensive online training programs that will build the knowledge and skills that are essential to becoming a first-class researcher. Each of the programs and their component parts can be undertaken independently or combined with other elements of the toolkit, supporting the unique needs of your institution and learners, from starting their master's degree to completing their PhD. The toolkit has been carefully designed to support researchers at each step of their journey, with updates to ensure that current challenges and developments, such as increased interdisciplinary research, working with supervisory teams, increased pressures for timely completion of PhD research, and digital research methods are integrated. There is no other training resource on the market that gives masters and PhD researchers such a comprehensive grounding in the essential research skills needed at each step of their journey to becoming an independent researcher. We've been extremely fortunate to work with our wonderful lead advisors, Fiona Denney and Douglas Halliday. They have both provided guidance on the overarching vision, aims and shape of the programme, and have reviewed and advised on the developing materials at each and every step of the process. Their expertise, their understanding of what postgraduate researchers need, and their creative, active ideas are present on every screen of the online programme. The Research Skills Toolkit is currently made up of 4 programmes available separately or as part of the toolkit. They are ethical research, research methods, transferable skills, and entrepreneurship in the research context, each one developing vital knowledge, capabilities, and confidence at every stage of a research project. Ethical research outlines ethical responsibilities for postgraduate researchers, both internally and externally. With examples across the disciplines, the programme helps researchers to see the importance of ethical decision-making in both life and research. Research methods covers the key principles of research methodologies applicable across disciplines and digs deeper into the unique challenges of each disciplinary area and unpicks the practicalities of interdisciplinary research. The Transferable Research Skills programme is made up of 8 courses, each one developing vital knowledge, capabilities and confidence at key stages of the research life cycle, including guidance on navigating academic conferences, publishing research and career planning. And last but not least, the Entrepreneurship in the Research Context programme is made up of 3 courses, comprehensively exploring the challenges and opportunities associated with becoming an entrepreneur in an academic context. If you're interested in seeing the full list of topics and courses available across the Research Skills Toolkit, there is an interactive flyer attached to this webinar, and also there will be an opportunity for Chris and my email address at the end of this webinar. The programs within the Research Skills Toolkit contain the following features: animations, dynamic diagrams, video interviews, and clear explanations to help introduce key concepts, interactive activities throughout to ensure that researchers remain engaged with their learning and to deepen understanding. There's lots of scenario-based activities as well, with nuanced examples and expert tips to help explore common challenges. Pods offering further information for researchers to explore and to help supplement core activities. There are regular polls throughout to provide opportunities for learners to anonymously contribute their opinions on key issues. And then there are summative quizzes at the end of the courses within each of the programs to help evaluate gaps in researchers' knowledge. We are, as we mentioned earlier on, we are regularly updating the Research Skills Toolkit. Our next updates will be Becoming a Researcher. This will be followed by updates to Disseminating Your Research and Beyond Research. Becoming a Researcher equips postgraduate researchers with the knowledge, skills and understanding they need as they begin their research journey, including negotiating the relationship with their supervisors, and that will be publishing this summer, managing a research project through success and problems with intellectual properties. So those are things to look out for over this year. We have a dedicated implementation team that provides ongoing support to all our customers. This support will often begin even before a subscription to ensure that the customer has been fully debriefed and is prepared for implementing the online training at their institution. For example, there are 2 program delivery options available currently, and we're developing a third. A subscribing institution can either choose to upload the content to their virtual learning environments, such as Blackboard, Moodle, Canvas, or they can use our dedicated online platform. Each option has different advantages, and our implementation team is on hand to find the best delivery option for the customer's context. If they do use our platform, we're able to help them to use our reporting options that will allow them to track usage and engagement with the program. Speaking of engagement, we also have a comprehensive asset pack containing a range of support materials, including a suite of blended learning materials, providing step-by-step guidance on suggested tutor-led and peer-to-peer activities mapped to the learning outcomes of the online courses and programs to assist institutions in providing training in a blended format. We also attend any promotional activities or key stakeholder meetings to help garner support and engagement in the training. And finally, if you would like to get in touch to find out more about the subscription and implementation options for the Research Skills Toolkit, please do feel free to get in touch with me at the email address listed on the screen. We will also be able to provide free trial access to the resource. Myself and the academic partnerships team will be circulating a recording which will include the webinar slides and handouts to you after this session. I will now hand you over back to Matthew for questions and answers. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for sharing that with us, Victoria. For Fiona and Douglas, the first question is, what were some of the biggest problems or challenges that you faced in pivoting to so much online learning in the last year?
Gosh, I think on the one hand, there was staff exhaustion, and because we spent a lot of time sort of upskilling staff very, very rapidly last year, and then literally crashing straight into the next academic year. So there was staff exhaustion, and I think there were also issues around, if I'm being honest, probably around communicating with students clearly enough about expectations, about how we were delivering things, how things were happening. So, you know, it was a pandemic response, and I think it was very, very confusing. And then something that I alluded to in the presentation, students being overseas in very difficult circumstances. So I had a student, for example, in Pakistan, in an area where she not only had the whole family hit by COVID, and they had to stay at home for treatment because the hospitals were full, and the hospitals were not a place you wanted to go to. But then the city she was at was flooded. Her laptop was plugged in at the time the flooding happened. There was an electrical outage which blew the transformer on the laptop. It was all kinds of things like that. So there was a lot of dealing with some very unexpected issues at a time when everybody's mental health was under strain, I think. So all of that was very complicated. Mm-hmm. Douglas?
Yeah, thanks, Fiona. Well, I mean, I would completely endorse that. I mean, I think for many research candidates, it was just a sense of disorientation, a sense of helplessness, a sense at which everything had come to a full and immediate stop with no real sense of what do I do now? You know, it was almost like being beamed onto an alien planet and say, well, here you are, get on with it. And, you know, and then you have to regroup, you have to, you know, connect with candidates, you have to send reassuring messages, you know, you have to think about how you can eventually, once they've got their own individual circumstances sorted out, how you can address the issue about the volume and intensity of research activity has been reduced. Research projects have been halted or delayed. Field work is a huge issue, not been possible. Access to laboratories, research facilities restricted, travel restricted. And, almost every dimension of undertaking a research project was impacted in some way. And, for some candidates, that would be about helping them to sort of regroup and reframe and maybe tackle a different aspect of their project, such as literature review, if that was appropriate and fitted in with where they were. For other candidates, you would need very different kinds of mitigations. It might be a sort of reframing of the research question, or a different sort of methodological approach, or sort of interrogating your project and thinking about the scale and the scope of data sets. Do you have to conduct sort of 50 experiments? Might sort of 10 or 20 give you the same sort of thing? So a whole range of different questions. And, overall, I think, the real challenge has been, I think, from the point of view as a supervisor, is just remaining connected with candidates and, communicating to them that, we are going through a similar kind of process. We understand at some level, and, we will work with them and help them to develop to ultimately ensure that they can be successful outcomes, which will undoubtedly be different from those originally envisaged, but nevertheless still valid and still meet, that broad range of criteria I showed in one of my slides about the sort of, the expected outcomes of doctoral programs, and also for masters as well. Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It's very comprehensive. So the next question is, what are the benefits of research skills training as budgets begin to tighten and a blended approach to that training specifically?
So from my point of view, I think regardless of budgets tightening, I think that this is part of an evolution in the way in which research skills training is heading and is being delivered. And I think one of the things that I mentioned in my presentation is the right information at the right time. And I think this is so important and something that's vastly underestimated actually in terms of training and development generally in universities. We sort of assume that because we put on a training course for researchers that somehow they're miraculously going to hold on to all of that information all the way through their research degree or all the way through their dissertation. And of course, that's not true, because that's just not a human way of being. And I think we all want the right information at the right time. And so the real benefits, I think, of an online approach or a blended approach, both of those options, is then being able to go back to the information when you need it. So it's not to minimise the importance of doing the training in the first place, but it's also the ability to be able to then access that training at the time that you really need it and access that particular section of it. So I like to see the Epigeum courses integrated with face-to-face training or with face-to-face, if it's possible, supervision, one-to-one supervision. But I think some of the benefits are really about students being able to access it in their own time as well, and being able to revisit the materials. So that's me.
Yes, thanks, Fiona. Yeah, I mean, completely agree with all of that. I mean, I think for me, one of the challenges, certainly in the UK, that UK universities face is a sort of separation in budgets into different categories and so on: staff budget, non-staff, graduate school, research training, HR, and so on. So, there is a complexity there, which, individuals will just have to deal with and to navigate as best they can. But, I mean, I think for me, Research Skills Toolkit offers a number of things. One is an opportunity to engage in an individual bespoke way and provide, information at a time when it is required, much as Fiona was saying, we offer training programs according to a planned schedule, but that doesn't necessarily always map exactly onto the requirements of researchers according to where they are in their individual research projects. So there is the opportunity to engage with a sort of flexible, rich resource, which is, filled with all the different sort of knowledge and expertise of all the sort of authors and reviewers and so on. And, that's a really valuable tool to have available for your candidates. And I mean, I agree with Fiona, I think the best impact from Research Skills Toolkit is when it's sort of embedded in some kind of blended environment, whether you might ask candidates to complete a module before having a workshop discussion on it, or whether you might have a sort of workshop exploring a range of issues and then go and ask candidates to undertake part of the training program and then maybe have some feedback about sort of learning and so on. It offers that real level of flexibility that, sometimes can be much more flexible than, an individual sort of training support officer or graduate skills training or Centre for Academic Development officer. So, I think for me, the real value comes in the sort of flexibility, the multiple entry points and the multiple pathways through it, and the ability to sort of blend it into, everything else that's going on in your environment. Yeah, thanks.
Excellent. Thank you both very much. And the next question, you've spoken obviously a bit about STEM and social sciences, but what provision does the Research Skills Toolkit have for research methods for the arts and humanities? I know you've mentioned a little bit about this in your presentation, Douglas.
Yeah, no, that's right. Well, I mean, as you will have seen from the slides presented, I mean, there is a specific course that looks at research methods in practice in the arts and humanities, so that sort of enables researchers to see how the different dimensions of research connect with individuals in those particular disciplines. And, the other thing I would say is if you go back to, the slide I displayed where I showed a sort of an image of part of the sort of FHEQ, the Framework for Higher Education Qualifications, creation and interpretation of new knowledge in different fields requires different approaches, different insights. But, the sort of the overarching aspects of that process, remain very similar. So that's why, the Research Skills Toolkit is structured the way it is, because, the scholarship and the level of intellectual rigor that is required in the arts and humanities is no different from what is required in sort of social sciences or engineering or STEM subjects. And, I think it's about also recognizing that, what has become increasingly clear is there are deep sort of ethical, philosophical questions about the role and place of research in society today that, requires the insights and expertise of, colleagues from, arts and humanities. And I mean, just to say from a personal point of view, the UK is regarded as being, one of the world leaders in digital entertainment. And there are many different dimensions of that nowadays. And, some of these, opportunities, these games, these worlds that are created, that can only be possible because of some of the insights that, have come to us through researchers in the arts and humanities. So, we very much, I think, value and welcome research in the arts and humanities, both as an equal aspect of research, but also as something that creates something of immense value to all of our cultures and societies today. Yeah, thank you.
Fiona, do you have anything to?
I don't have anything much to add to that because Douglas was very comprehensive, but just to reinforce that the Research Skills Toolkit absolutely does cover arts and humanities, and we have worked very hard to consider aspects such as the creative industries and culture more widely. So just to add that in.
That's absolutely fantastic. Thank you both very much. So I think that's the end of our questions. So all that remains is to thank Victoria and our colleague Maddie, who's been working behind the scenes, for their help with the webinar. to thank Fiona and Douglas for their time, fascinating presentations and sharing their expertise on this subject. And finally, all of you for attending. Have a lovely rest of the day.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.